Go.
Okay, well, welcome to Grace and Truth, and it's a pleasure to be with you all this morning. Kim, would you offer a word of prayer to open the class, please?
Be happy to. Let's bow our heads. Thank you, Lord, for your many blessings and for a new Sabbath day. Please be with us as we study your word. Bless us and take care of us and help us in our study today. Please also give Terry and Paula safe travels as they come home. Please hear our silent prayer requests as well. Is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. So today we're studying 1 Corinthians 13, a chapter that we all know very well. And I've basically broken the lesson study discussion into two parts. Love explained, love experienced. So 1 Corinthians 13 is explaining love. In my mind, the rest of the chapters that are in the book of Corinthians is really love experienced, as Paul and his contemporaries were experiencing it there in the church at Corinth. Today, and we've spent the past few weeks talking about how love was being experienced in the church at Corinth. This unity, sex outside of marriage, marriage and its challenges, the responsibility of freedom, culture, its impact, behavior, love experience in the life of the church of Corinth. And we walked through those chapters. And today, Paul is talking about love explained. What I'd like to do in our lesson study is reverse the order. So we'll spend, hopefully, the first part of our lesson study talking about love explained. And then I'd like to transition and talk about love experienced in our lives in the 20th century. What do we see and what examples do we have? So the lesson study just has those two parts, love experienced and love explained. In the experience of the Church of Corinth, there were two different philosophies that were being thrown about or discussed or lived by. So essentially, before we begin there, let me start with an experience I had about a month ago. I walked into a department of a hospital that would remain unnamed. And I asked to speak to the receptionist at the desk. I asked her, I said, I would like to reach Diane. And she looked at me and said, what department does she work in? And what's her full name? And not being a very patient person, I just looked at her with a certain eye of almost contempt and impatience and says, she works in this department. You should know her. And she looked at me and she said, sir, I don't really work here. I'm just helping out today. And I was rebuked because I was looking at her and that experience through a lens that was filled with certain assumptions about her knowledge, her experience, her customer service behavior. And when she said, sir, I don't work here, I'm just here for the day, that lens was taken out and I saw her in a different lens. I apologized and together we searched the list and found Diane and she called her. And what Paul is talking about here in 1 Corinthians 13 is simply this. What lens do we use to interpret life, reality, and relationships? What lens do we use? And his argument to us is that the best lens to use is the lens of love. And if we would practice the lens of love and interpret relationships and human behaviors through that lens, his argument is we would be flourishing in our lives. And when we do not use the lens of love to interpret and to relate to one another, we languish or we get angry. And that to me is the message of 1 Corinthians 13. What lens do you use in life to interpret and cultivate human relationships? So in the church at Corinth, there was a group of people who said behavior didn't matter. They were what they call the precursors of what became the cardinal belief of Gnosticism. Our bodies are irrelevant. The spirit is all that matters. What you do with your body is irrelevant, and you have that kind of a freedom. As long as you keep your spirit pure, what you do with your body, whether you have sex with X, Y, and Z, whatever, it doesn't matter. The spirit is all that matters. Behavior does not matter. There was a faction in the church that felt that way. There was another faction that said, correct behavior is all that matters. We must be generous. We must do dramatic demonstrations of faith. We must speak in tongues. We must prophesy. If we do those things, all is well. We are holy. Correct behavior is all that matters. And in the midst of that argument, Paul comes in and says, listen, your body is important. It will be resurrected. It's the temple of God. You need to take care of it. You people who want to become Gnostics and just deal with the spirit, you're confused. And for you people who think that behavior is all that matters, if it's behavior without love, even if it is prophesying, even if it is giving your body to be burned, even if it is generosity, even if it is speaking in tongues, it's all a meaningless and not very helpful. And then Paul goes on to talk about the ideal lens. So in 1 Corinthians, when we get to chapter 13, verses 4 to 7, Paul is talking about the ideal lens. And I'd like to read it. I'm reading it from the New Literal Translation. Love is patient and kind. Love is not jealous or boastful or proud or rude. It does not demand its own way. It is not irritable, and it keeps no record of being wronged. It does not rejoice about injustice, but rejoices whenever the truth wins out. Love never gives up, never loses faith, is always hopeful, and endures through every circumstance. Notice Paul does not define love. He just says what love does. And that's the lens that 1 Corinthians 13 offers us and says, this is the ideal lens through which we must approach and conduct relationships. Without love, nothing matters. Any comments, thoughts, feedback on that, Bill? I think you're muted, Bill. Still muted. Charlene?
Yeah, when I listen to people's story and what they're saying, sometimes I think of these two people. One was Paul Harvey, who always had the rest of the story in his broadcast, and the other was Dr. Jack Provenza in Loma Linda, who had a class called Situational Ethics. And both of those things I sometimes think of, and I don't often know everything about the person, but I try to listen with open ears.
Thank you. Bill, give it a try.
Who produces this love in us? I mean, it's not something that we do. I mean, love is a choice, right? And our choice is, who do we let God do it, or do we produce it? You see what I'm saying?
Yes, somebody wants to answer that question for Bill?
Well, I ask you because you got that spiritual connection.
Paul says that we are broken individuals who are saved by the grace of God. It is God's grace that puts that love in our hearts and helps us to have that lens. That would be what I'd put out there for your consideration.
Well, our choice is to let the Holy Spirit change our heart, isn't it?
That's right.
Now, we can circumvent that, and some of us could do a great job producing what others want to see, but I'm not very good at that.
That's a good point. Now, notice what Paul says here, just to move it along a little bit in verse 9. He says, our knowledge is partial and incomplete, and even the gift of prophecy reveals only part of the whole picture. But when the time of perfection comes, these partial things will become useless. When I was a child, I spoke and thought and reasoned as a child. But when I grew up, I put away childish things. Now we see things imperfectly, like puzzling reflections in a mirror, but then we will see everything with perfect clarity. Feedback on that passage. To me, this is one of the most important insights the Apostle Paul shares with us. I'd like to get your feedback on what those verses mean to you. Any thoughts?
For me, that verse in verse 9 that you read there was one of the most compelling ones as I read it this week again, because it gives me a sense of humility and being humble, because I only know in part. It's an impartial view. I may think I know all things, but he says, remember that all of us only know in part. And when that which is perfect comes, we'll know in a deeper sense. So it gives me a sense of humility as I deal with relationships and with others and with myself.
Thank you. Anyone else?
In preparing to teach the lesson next week in 1 Corinthians 14, it's about speaking in tongues and prophecy, and verse 8 and 9 kind of speak to that. Prophecy and speaking in unknown languages and special knowledge will become useless.
What does it say also about our view of truth when we say we have the truth? What does that mean in the light of these verses?
Jesus is the truth.
I'm sorry, Bill?
Jesus is the truth.
Yes. Well, for me, it means that our view of the truth is limited by our own imperfections. In other words, we are doing the best, but it's not truth in the absolute sense. Paul says we're seeing through a glass darkly. We're still thinking like children, and there is a lot to learn. And it introduces us to the idea that the path of salvation is a growing path. That lens through which we see each other is an imperfect lens that is constantly needing to be refined and improved upon. And we should never, ever get to the place where we are so fixed in our thinking that there is no more room for growth, change, and development. And there is a tendency within the Christian church to say we have it, we own it, it's settled, and it's purified. I remember as a young man meeting and studying the Bible with Jehovah's Witnesses, and their interpretation of the cleansing of the sanctuary is exactly that. The doctrines have been purified, the sanctuary has been cleansed, and the belief system that they stand for is perfect and not in need of any growth or change. That was what they shared with me, as opposed to the rest of us who were imperfect and having mistakes. This passage for me is humility, because it says we need to have an open mind, constantly learning. Interestingly enough, a lot of work has been done by a psychologist by the name of Carol Dweck, and she talks about two kinds of beliefs that inhabit the human mind: a fixed versus a growth mind. A mind that is set and has no more to learn, a mind that is given to effort and improvement. And the argument is that true resilience, the ability to cope in life, is a function of having a growth and an open mind that is given to effort, as opposed to a fixed mind that says, here am I, and I have nothing more to learn. I've been given that ability. I'd encourage you to read some of her work, because it has implications for relationships as well. All kinds of relationships: work relationships, friendship relationships, marriage relationships. So Paul here, in these verses of 1 Corinthians 13, has said, look, the way that we should approach life is through the aperture of love. Now, the New Testament has three different words, and the word that is used here, agape, is a moral, intellectual love. Phileo is a friendly love, and eros is a sexual love. They are all like a transitional lens. They're all part of the lens of love. It's not one or the other, it's all three. And when Paul is speaking here, he's speaking about agape, but it embraces all the dimensions, in my mind, of love. And he's saying that's what we ought to practice. That's what, by the grace of God, we ought to experience. So with that, as a sort of an introduction and addressing love explained, its superiority, its nature, and its permanence, I'd like to talk a little bit and transition our lesson discussion to love experienced. How do we experience love in this life today? We have studied how the Corinthian church experienced love in Paul's day, their shortcomings. And I want to introduce this section by reading a stanza from a familiar hymn. Dear Lord and Father of mankind, forgive our foolish ways. Breathe through the heats of our desire, thy coolness and thy balm. Let sense be dumb, let flesh retire. Speak through the earthquake, wind and fire, O still small voice of calm. I think of this because when we experience love in our imperfection, a lot of our foolish ways show through. Let me start a little bit to introduce this by quoting for you from some popular songs. Some of you may recognize these words. Tonight, you're mine completely. You give your love so sweetly. Tonight, the light of love is in your eyes. But will you love me tomorrow? Carole King wrote those words, and her husband, actually Carole King wrote the melody, and her husband, her former husband, Jerry Coffin, wrote the lyrics. And it's really sad to think that after they had lived together, they ended up divorced. But will you love me tomorrow? Listen to these words. How do you keep the music playing? How do you make it last? How do you lose yourself to someone and never lose your way? And since you know we're always changing, how can it be the same? Those are stories, songs and lyrics and melodies. And if I could sing, I would have sung the tunes for you that speak about how we experience love and our foolish ways today. One more quote. My life is unconditional. My love is unconditional. Make no mistake. I don't ask for much. Just be honest with me. It's the cry of every human heart as we talk about the lens of love. So these words reflect our experience as we look at life and as we live life through the lens of this love. It's not perfect. It's ever improving, needing intention, attention, and commitment. Let me prime the pump by telling you of a few experiences I have encountered in my life and some that I have read about. This couple was a very loyal couple in church, and they lived the faith and they were very zealous. And one day, after we became friends, we sat down and she explained to me that life was not always like that. There was a time when they were just living in a house, just living in the house. He was going his way, she was going her way. And then they made a decision to study the Bible. They studied themselves into Seventh-day Adventism, and they built their love and their marriage back up again. That was their story. And it took work, it took attention and intention and commitment, but it worked for them. And then I read another story of a couple. They met in Europe. She was an American, he was a German. They were on scholarships. They got to know each other on a cruise. She went on a world tour for 2 years. And the critical part of the story that I liked was after they agreed that they were in love, he was a German engineer and he lived in his very neat, tidy environment. She was a backpacker that was sloppy and careless with her things. And she said they had to get together and work it out. And the story ends with them having married successfully for 25 years, 2 children, happily married. The message is they had to work it out. The point I'd like to make is love requires work. And someone has said, and I agree with this, the most destructive of all relationships is the thought that if it requires work, something is wrong. The most destructive thought of all relationships is the assumption or the belief that if it requires work, something is wrong. I'd like your feedback and thoughts on that, please. Bill.
Well, this is getting off of that just a little bit. I'm back to this idea that do we produce love or does God produce it in us when we surrender? I'm asking, that's not a
I know you're asking, and I'm asking the class to respond to that.
Hey,
Yeah, Tim or Brett. You're muted. You're muted.
I believe we're all shown love when we enter this world. That's a start as a baby, and we learn that from our parents. So that's to kind of answer a little bit of Bill's comment, we're shown through as a baby. I mean, my parents love me, so my assumption is they show me love as me being as a baby and growing up.
Yes, yes, you have to. So there's a learning bill, is what Brett is saying there. Who else? Help me there, Lauren. I may not see all the screens.
I'm watching, but I was going to speak. So I have a book somewhere in my library here. I think it's Gary Smalley is the author, and the title is "Love is a Decision," as opposed to "Love is a Feeling," because the feeling, I think, is what attracts us to another. And if the relation, that's all there is, then it's easy to say, well, I don't feel that way towards you anymore, so let's split up, as opposed to love as a decision. It's a decision I make daily.
And you work at that decision too.
And you work at the decision. Yeah, good point. House of Goshen has their hand up.
Hi, Joseph here. You know, Fiona reminds me every day that love is work. And because it is work, it's like Lauren said, it's a decision. When we make a decision, we work on making it work.
Yes, I work
But
on you every day.
but I think there is another dimension to that too. So I'll share a little story. It just happened yesterday. I just came back last night from one of our markets board and medical executive committee retreat. It was a very successful meeting. I led the meeting. I had lots to talk in it. And at the end of the meeting, the market CEO talks to the group, and the group was about 50 people. And the market CEO reflects on the first time they met me a few years ago. And the person says that they thought I was yelling at them. And they thought that I was a little obnoxious, more than a little actually. And the person was talking to the 50 people group. They're all, physicians and board members. And then the person ended by saying that it took them a little time to realize that I was not yelling, I was talking, I was passionate. And then realized the value that we created and all that. And then the person gave me a hug and showed the appreciation. The point I'm making is this. That when you look beyond the obvious, you start to see love. I mean, I almost had tears in my eyes. And I don't cry often. I don't cry at all. So I almost had tears in my eyes during that meeting. The person saw beyond the obvious. It was not yelling, it was not obnoxious, it was a passionate way of expressing opinion and providing help. I think that's what love is sometimes. Not to write off somebody because you were a little bit raising your voice and obnoxious, perhaps in the example you gave earlier, and then things got on the right track and moved on. The other person could have written you off and told you, go ask for Diana's another department, call somebody else to help you find that person. Well, she did not do that. She worked with you and she opened the list and you found the person. And that market CEO, which by the way, the story the market CEO told, I was not aware of. And it, according to the person, it happened about 6 years ago. And I couldn't remember when it happened. But the person saw beyond and was able to express love.
Love you anyway.
Love me anyway.
In spite of your harshness. Feedback, thoughts, comments? Thank you, Joseph. Yes. Someone, Marcy just said, I'm starting to meddle. I'm not meddling, I'm just trying to understand. Let me show you an example of love, if I can do it. Share screen.
Mm-hmm.
So I have to have an instructor here. Look at this.
The father, his boy, and the birthday wish. In Amarillo, Texas, 8-year-old Corbin Ormson and his birthday wish about to come true.
Where are we going first?
Let's see, Daddy.
Corbin's father, Christian, has been in the hospital battling COVID. In the beginning, in a coma, on a ventilator for weeks. They have not seen each other in 55 days. That 8-year-old dressing in protective gear, the hospital agreeing that with dad now testing negative, that they would allow Corbin into the ICU for that birthday gift, a birthday wish from his father, seeing him for the first time.
How are you?
That father reaching for his son's hand.
Anybody? Welcome to the top. Happy birthday.
A happy birthday from his father.
Good to see you. You know, just see your eyes.
And Corbin's family telling us tonight that that hospital visit with his son was the inspiration he needed. That father, now in rehab, another step forward in getting back to his family.
So there's an emotion involved with that. I choke every time I look at that. What insights do we get from that? What does it tell us about love there? What does that experience tell us about love?
It's not something we produce. It's a reaction.
Yeah,
Love is a good feeling.
it's a good feeling. Go ahead, please.
It's a relationship.
It's a relationship. What was the effect on the father?
Healing. It was healing for him.
They said his recovery was just hastened by that love of the little boy. Bob, were you saying something? So love builds up. It's work. It builds up. It strengthens. It actually it improves our health, is the point I was making. And it challenges us. I want to show you another aspect of love or a lack of love. Yes. So this is an article that I read. I think Paula posted it on Facebook, and I copied it. And maybe at the end of the class, I'll have Lauren attach it. It's entitled Judged, Rejected, and Feeling It. And I read it for you as you read it. For the first time in my life, I felt discrimination from my fellow believers. Brothers and sisters in Christ had acted to exclude us, an action based on judgment with no conversation. She's the wife of a Seventh-day Adventist minister. I was not one of them. I was the other. Someone to be kept at arm's length, watched carefully, and certainly not to be trusted. Gather the children and walk away. This was a new feeling, a new reality. Anyone having questions was apparently not to be tolerated. Opinions different than theirs were not allowed. We were dangerous. And then she says, my story is so insignificant. And I do want to emphasize the word insignificant as compared to the experience of so many other groups that face discrimination. People of color or diverse ethnicity, the elderly, those experiencing gender bias, individuals in sexual minority groups. I could go on and on. If they aren't like me, I'll shun them and hopefully they will go away. I really don't want to know more about them or their experience. It could taint me or my children. Let's just gather behind the walls of the church, get in lockstep, and eventually they will leave.
Wow.
And then she goes on, she says, Jesus loved the disenfranchised, women, the oppressed, racially separated, the unclean and the poor. At a time when segregation of genders was the norm, Jesus treated women with the same respect he treated men. He didn't hesitate to heal the Roman centurion's servant. When asked who his neighbor was, Jesus stunned the crowd by telling them a parable with a Samaritan as the hero. Jesus's approach to the leper and the woman had been bleeding for 12 years, both clean, unclean, untouchable, and outcasts in their society. was extraordinary. And finally, Paul summarizes his message like this. And now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. What? Your faith, your Christian beliefs don't trump love? The greatest commandment given is to love one another. Does this mean love those you don't like, don't agree with, those living in a way you don't understand or approve? And what does love mean anyway? Can't I just love them from afar without actually associating with them? That's it. Comments, feedback, thoughts. The flip side of love. I showed you the little boy, innocent, not understanding. He couldn't define, he could only experience love. And I showed you a member of our church who experienced the discrimination because her husband, as a minister, had preached a sermon that was questionable in terms of its theology. And she extrapolates from that how others might feel, because she goes on to say, you know, I could be disingenuous, I could just keep my mouth shut and I won't be isolated. Talk to me about this a little bit. Judged, rejected, and feeling it. Comments? Bill.
You gotta unmute yourself, Bill.
Years old now. I was going to say we might have to change the outside until God can change the inside.
It's probably the simplest and yet the hardest thing to actually do, moving from knowledge and talking about the gospel to living the gospel. Thank you, Marcy. That's what we're really talking about. Some hands are up. Lubasi, would you?
Thank you. Let me just share briefly a story that happened in 2007. I went over to Ukraine to preach in a city called Kharkov. It was a 10-day series. And on my first night there came to me a lady. She was in her probably 70s, and said to me that she was never gonna love me. She didn't like me, and she didn't like people of my kind. And I thought, well, I'm kind of used to that. I've heard so much of that. It's all right. Now, I thought she wasn't going to show up the second night. But when she showed up the second night, that distracted my message. The third night, she was there. Fourth night, until the 10th night. And every night, she sat right in front pew. And she was a constant distractor to me because of what she said to me the very first night. That I don't love you, and I don't think I can ever love people like you. And because she sat right there in front, it was a constant reminder to me, like, you know, it's gonna be tough until Jesus comes. But on the 10th night, when I was done with my final message, she walked up the platform and demanded for my mic. And I didn't know what she wanted. I mean, she was speaking in Ukrainian, and through a translator. So she told the translator not to translate until she was done with everything she wanted to say. And I learned later on that she actually instructed everyone not to show emotion as she was gonna speak what she wanted to say. She was gonna say what she wanted to say. And when she was done, she handed the mic back to me, and then the translator picked it up and said, she was now very sure, more than ever before, that she was going to go to heaven because God had shown her how to love the unlovable in her life. It brought tears to my eyes. I didn't know how to react. She came and gave me a hug that lasted like 5 minutes. I cried over her shoulders. I think I wetted her blouse. I don't know. I can't remember. But it was such a very powerful feeling for me. And I felt rejected at first. And to be honest with you, every night that preceded that first night made me feel like I couldn't love her back. And it was that last moment that made me love her beyond my capacity. Let me put it that way. It had to be God who melted my heart to actually embrace her that way.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lubasi. Charlene.
I was thinking of the wonderful instruction from Jesus when he said, love one another as I have loved you.
Yes, there is a sign on a church board on Edgewater. It says, love is not a Love one another is not a suggestion. I think it is very interesting. So the challenge of love in our experience today in the 20th century is a challenge that invites us to consider difference, to consider the fact that we don't know everything, to consider the fact that we should have an open mind and we should practice in all areas of life acceptance and not rejection. I want to talk about, I want to introduce you, some of you probably know already, a clinical psychologist by the name of Gottman. Now his work has been in marriage and family, but I think it speaks to all kinds of relationships. And Gottman says, there are 4 horsemen that challenge love, that cause marriages to break apart, and that cause relationships to falter. The 4 horsemen that Gottman presents to us are these: criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. In every relationship, Gottman says, every one of us is guilty of criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. The challenge is when we allow one of those to take residence in our relationship, then it eventually fractures and breaks up the relationship. Our humanity is such that from time to time there will be flashes of criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling, and we have to forgive one another when those behaviors occur. But the challenge to each of us is not to allow any one of those to take residence in our heart. My question to you is, as you view relationships and you reflect on this, criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling, which of these do you think is the worst?
Stonewalling.
Bill? I didn't hear you.
I'm on my 3rd marriage. Don't ask me.
Oh, I thought you were saying something. Okay. Anyone? Criticism, contempt?
Linda has got her hand up, Si. You're muted, Linda.
I think it's a combination of contemptuous criticism, rolling the eyes, you know, putting someone down, kind of the combination.
You actually elevated the discussion, and I hadn't even thought of blending them, but you're absolutely correct. You can blend these two: contemptuous criticism. Anyone else?
I think defensiveness is really a big part of it, because to me, that's where self has got such a hold of your heart that you just have to defend yourself because you're so right.
Randa, thank you. Charlene, Randa, unmute.
Well, my opinion is that for the first 3, there's still a chance of communicating. You don't like what the person's saying, but there's a dialogue. Stonewalling, there's no longer any dialogue, and there's no chance of any improvement whatsoever.
Yeah. Cheryl.
anyway, I was just thinking about all this, criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. I think the bottom line is from the judgment. And when you judgmental about things, about a person, then you start having criticism and you build contempt. And then you become defensive in your conversation, because I did have unfavorable experience with my daughter last week on Mother's Day, and it didn't go very well. And after that, I did think a lot about this thing. And, and finally we sorted through it, and the following week we resolve it. We both have a heart-to-heart conversation. And so we put our guard down. We stop being defensive towards each other. And I think when we approach just like Greg Ellis, with humility, then you're not judgmental to the other person or other group or whatever. You don't think that you are superior than other people or other person. I think all this thing will come down, there will be no more criticism. You don't have contempt, and you will not stonewalling because you're humble, and so so I think I have to teach myself, because it's very easy to be judgmental. You see somebody like this, oh my gosh, what did he do? Especially in my work, I see all kind of people, people who is taking drugs, people who is mischievous, people who is unfaithful, and people with bad habits, just as simple as smoking or not sleeping enough, those, I can be very judgmental. So I have to remind myself of that. For us, it's the most subtle things. We always praise workaholic, but workaholic is not healthy. And and so as simple as that, because we don't eat meat, therefore we are holier than thou. No, not really.
Thank you, Cheryl. That's so true. We all practice these behaviors almost automatically, and we have to literally pay attention and make an effort. And for me, it's all relationships. The marriage relationship is the most intimate, but even our working relationships. I have to tell you, there's a Harvard article which I'll probably have Lauren post, and it was published this year. And if I can find it very quickly, but it says even in work, love matters, and I can't seem to find it right now. Even at work, and they're not talking about romantic love, they're just talking about being thoughtful and kind to others. The article, thank you, the article is employees who feel love perform better. Here we're talking about companionate love, which is far less intense than romantic love. Companionate love is based on warmth, affection, and connection rather than passion. And it talks about the fact that people want to feel that way at work. Even at work, we're talking about those relationships. So Gottman says there are 7 principles that guide an affectionate and successful relationship. In his context, marriage, I'm extending it to all relationships. The first one, he says, is the things you like and the things you don't like. Sit down and have an understanding of what that other person likes and dislikes, and have a conversation about that. Then he says the second, nurture fondness and admiration, the opposite of contempt. Cultivate, like a garden, fondness and admiration. The third, turn toward each other rather than away from one another. Physically turn toward each other, but mentally and emotionally turn toward each other. 4, share decision making. I have a hard time with that. Put on a blue pants and a black shirt this morning, and Carolyn immediately said, change that pants. And it's kind of like, who will see it? And she says, I will. So I had to put on a black pair of pants to match the black shirt. Share decision making, not just in clothes, but in everything else. 5, solve your soluble problems. Not every problem can be solved, but solve the ones that you can be. 6, overcome gridlock. It doesn't help to create gridlock. And finally, create shared meaning with each other. Those were his principles. So Bill, to your question, do we have to work at it? The answer is yes. And we need God's grace to soften our hearts, to humble our proud spirits so that we can build on it. I'd like to show you a quote. Can I go back on the screen? Yes. I'd like to show you a quote to bring this to an end. Not that one, yeah. Go down to the other one, there. So this is a song, but I think it's a modern version of 1 Corinthians 13 in a sense. I found a love, the kind to hold, the kind that lifts you from the bottom of your soul, the kind that makes the broken whole. You see my weakness and stay no matter what. I found a love that pulls me through. And that, to me, is what Paul was talking about when he said that each of us needs to relate to the other, to bring the best out in that person. And when we practice and work with that lens of love, we will build community, we will build fellowship. Many of us go through life. Many of us just go through life languishing. And Paul says he would like us to go through life flourishing. And we go through life flourishing when we find that love and build those relationships and cultivate that community. We should be flourishing rather than languishing. And I say to each of us this morning, if there is even one person who is in our class today listening to that, and you feel you're in the wilderness, that you haven't found that love, remember, Hagar was in the wilderness and God was there with her. Moses was in the wilderness and God found him at the burning bush. So if you're in the wilderness this morning, take courage that God is there with you in the wilderness, and you can find that love by the grace of God. That's my lesson for the morning. I want to wish you the very best, and I want to